murder people. It takes people to commit an international crime. And the same thing is actually true of genocide. But we divide international law on issues of genocide, for example, between state responsibility and individual responsibility. State responsibility for genocide, breaches of the Genocide Convention, are an issue for the International Court of Justice. So for example, you probably know that South Africa has brought Israel to the International Court of Justice over alleged genocide in Gaza. That's at the International Court of Justice. A separate issue is international criminal law, which focuses on the individuals who are most responsible for committing genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity. And that's the universe we're going to talk about today, holding individuals accountable. But it's important to note that both states and individuals can be held accountable for genocide and other types of violations of international law, but we are focusing on individual responsibility. So, can anybody tell me one of the 4 core international crimes? One.
One or just 4?
Tell me one. Tell me one.
Genocide.
Thank you. Genocide. Yes. Crimes against humanity.
War.
War crimes.
Yes, war crimes.
Nope. Not child abuse. There's one more. Yeah. It is not ethnic cleansing. It's interesting that there's a focus on ethnic cleansing. Because of a whole bunch of reasons, ethnic cleansing is not actually a crime under international law. It is found under the responsibility to protect, and it is clearly an atrocity, but it is not a crime under international law. What it is a composite of international crimes. So, for example, ethnic cleansing can often be the way by which genocide is committed. Or ethnic cleansing can be done by forcing people off of their lands. So it can be related to both the war crime, if there is a war, or the crime against humanity of forcibly transferring a population. But it has never been criminalized under international law. I know a lot of people find that surprising, but it is a fact of international law that it is not a core international crime. There's one more though. There you go, crime of aggression. Thank you very much. Okay. That's awesome. So we got all 4, and I'll walk you through them. Now, let's start with war crimes. If I move, you can still hear me? Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. So, broadly speaking, you probably know this from, even media. The media has done a better job in covering war crimes, right? It stems from, when we think about international criminal law in relation to war crimes, it actually stems from a different kind of law, international humanitarian law that is much older than international criminal law, actually starts from the 19th century, and the development of efforts, legal norms, to try to reduce the amount of harm that civilians experience during war, to limit the harm that civilians have. And what international humanitarian law does at its core is it makes a distinction between people who are fighting, who are often referred to as belligerents, right? People actually fighting in a war, and the stuff they fight with. Their barracks, their whatever it is, their military installation, right? Their objects, the property that they use, and that is distinguished from civilians, people who are not operating in conflict, or protected persons. So, for example, people who were involved in war, a belligerent, but who has now surrendered, or as we would call them, a prisoner of war. Or people who are actually with soldiers, for example, but are offering particular forms of assistance like religious assistance or religious advice or religious presence. So religious personnel are protected persons, civilians are protected persons, medics are protected persons, and so too are certain forms of civilian infrastructure, like hospitals, right? Now, it can get a little bit murky because a hospital can also become a military installation if enough military people, belligerents, actually enter it and start using it. But that's the general distinction that international humanitarian law tries to make, because its ultimate goal is to minimize the impact of war on people who are not participating in the war or who were but are no longer participating in the war, right? So people who leave active military duty, for example. Now, war crimes law, or the law of armed conflict, or international humanitarian law, applies in both international armed conflicts, so wars between states, as well as non-international armed conflict, internal conflicts, or in non-legal terms, we typically just call them civil wars or internal wars, right? There are actually some differences here. This is very unfortunate. Some things are war crimes in international armed conflicts that aren't really war crimes in non-international armed conflict. It's not a harmonized system, which is unfortunate, but it remains unfortunately to be the case. But again, generally speaking, what the goals here are, including in the Rome Statute that I'll walk you through, is again to try to protect people who are not participating in hostilities. It's entirely about trying to minimize the costs of war to those who are not actually engaged in war. So, how does it do this? I'll walk you through, it is so long, the war crimes section of the Rome Statute. I will never be able to do it justice, so I'll walk you through some of the war crimes that are articulated. But it's important to first note that according to the International Criminal Court, but only the International Criminal Court, war crimes are those things that are committed as part of a plan or a policy or as part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. That's how the ICC views its jurisdiction over war crimes. It has to be large-scale and part of a plan. States or other organizations do not have to abide by that policy idea. A singular isolated war crime, like the execution of a prisoner of war, is still a war crime. But for the ICC, it has to be part of a larger scale plan or policy. So it notes that a number of things from the Geneva Conventions of 1949 can be considered war crimes when they are great breaches. And then the Rome Statute actually lists some of the things. Willful killing. Unfortunately, law does this thing where it's like, it could be really simple, but it's law, so it won't be. Willful killing is just murder, right? I mean, that's what no one would, in a domestic context, no one who shot someone else would be like, that was a willful killing. No, you'd say that was murder. And that's what that means. It just means murder. Torture, including biological experiments, extensive destruction of property and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity. This is important. Civilians can only live and thrive and be okay if they also have access to civilian property, right? So, for example, destroying a clinic can be a war crime, right? Because you need access to a war crime. Destroying generators, electricity generators, can be a war crime if the generators are destroyed in order to make people susceptible to cold weather, right? So property is important here too. Depriving prisoners of war of the right to a fair and regular trial. Unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement of people. It's very, very common to see unlawful transfers of people, right? When we're thinking about Gaza right now, for example, what people are concerned about is the unlawful, forcible transfer of people outside of Gaza in what Israeli officials are calling voluntary migration. When you don't have clinics and your bombs and every hospital is being bombed and your roads are being bombed, there's no such thing as voluntary. That's not voluntary, that's force, right? So unlawful deportation or transfer of people, taking hostages is a war crime. And then what the Rome Statute does is it lists a whole bunch of things that are war crimes under international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. And they overlap, broadly speaking, with some small differences. But broadly speaking, there are things like directly attacking civilians is a war crime. You can never directly or indiscriminately, as we would put it, attack civilians, ever, or protected persons. You cannot willfully attack a medical professional in a context of war. That is a war. You cannot attack a peacekeeper. They're a protected person as well. Intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects. Again, think of clinics or hospitals or schools. Entities, physical infrastructure has protection if it's meant for civilian use. You can only attack those areas where, or those buildings or those properties, if doing so is part of a military objective. For example, let's say there's a clinic, everybody leaves the clinic, because they're afraid for their lives. All of the doctor civilians leave. A rebel group enters the clinic and sets up operations. You can attack that building because it's lost its protection. But if it's used for civilian purposes, it retains protection. Intentionally directing attacks against humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping missions. Launching attacks knowing that they will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage civilian objects or widespread long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. Very important. Something we don't typically think about. But in the context of Ukraine, for example, you may remember that Russia launched attacks against the Chernobyl power plant, right? The thing that, well, it's got the sarcophagus and it protects from the leakage of nuclear waste and nuclear materials. Had Russia actually bombed that and released materials, nuclear materials or radioactive materials into the environment, that could have been a war crime by damaging the natural environment itself. Not just by hurting physical human beings or human populations. Attacking or bombarding by whatever means town, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives, right? Again, there's a principle called military necessity where if you are fighting a war, people are fighting a war, they can take over villages, they can do certain things. IHL does not say you can't kill civilians, but it must be proportional. Your conduct must be guided by military necessity, and you cannot target civilians. Killing or wounding a combatant who has surrendered. So that's the protection of a prisoner of war, for example. The transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. So if a foreign power occupies another place, it becomes an occupying power with a whole bunch of obligations that flow under international humanitarian law. People have to have the right to go to school, go to the doctors, practice their own religion. You can't enforce your own religion. And you cannot move your own population into that people's territory. Can you think of an example of where that might be happening today? Yeah, the West Bank. Right? The International Court of Justice, for example, effectively noted that war crimes had been committed in the West Bank, right? In the occupation of the West Bank. And one of the things that is happening there is the changing of the demographics of Palestinian territories by the introduction of settler communities. Russia has done the same thing in Crimea, right? And in eastern parts of Ukraine. It's taken over, it's an occupying power, and it moves the Russian population into occupied territory, and then it says, now let's vote on whether you want to be part of Russia or Ukraine. Well, if you introduce 2 million Russians into occupied territory and they all vote to stay in Russia, it's not correct, right? It's not what you're supposed to do, and indeed it can amount to a war crime. Yeah? Yes. Yes.
For example, what I can say is in the line, if it's a listener, I'm assuming we have this issue where the Koreans are, away from the areas, and replaced as Amharics, still not over time. Is this also the one situations?
I believe so. I never like saying anything unless I have the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but I believe that it is also included. But I can check when we have a break to make sure that kind of displacement. But typically, forcible transfers would be unlawful. But the challenge here is that a state can't be the occupying power of a part of its own state, right? So in this instance, we're really talking, occupying powers are foreign powers. So this particular element, I believe, would only be relevant for interstate, because only another state can occupy another state, right? No state can occupy part of itself. But forcible transfers, for example, can amount to also crimes against humanity. And I'll talk about that in a second, and we can look at the Rome Statute on the internal armed conflicts. directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, historical monuments, right? Attacking effectively the cultural or day-to-day life of civilians can be a war crime. Intentionally using starvation, starving people intentionally as a weapon of war is a war crime. Conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15, so the use of child soldiers. This number 15 is quite controversial. Some people think it should be 18, other people think it should be 16. International law draws a line at 15. Some people think, again, that's too young. Other people think that's appropriate, but it is 15. So 16-year-olds can, in fact, at least per the Rome statute, be conscripted. One of the reasons for that is actually the United States, which starts to conscript and bring in soldiers into its military in high school. So, this is an image of a war crimes prosecutor in Ukraine. Can you think of some of these crimes that have occurred, war crimes that have happened in Ukraine? Or can you tell me of any war crimes that you know of in Ukraine? Yes, please. Okay, so forcibly transferring children into Russia. Good. Anything else? Sorry? Okay, so maybe, I mean, you can't tell here, but this would appear, at least on the face of it, to suggest that a civilian building was destroyed, an apartment building, right? And if this was a civilian building and if it was purposely attacked as a civilian building, that would definitely be a war crime because you can never direct your attacks at civilians. Okay, so maybe it's of a civilian object or property, yeah. Anything else?
The destruction of public service organizations like hospitals.
Good. Maternity wards, we saw maternity wards, hospitals, destruction of civilian property, right? Yeah, absolutely. Hospitals. And there's been a recent, just this week, reporting actually of the execution, for example, of soldiers who walked out of a building and surrendered, and they had their hands up. In that moment, when you have your hands up and you declare that you are surrendering, you are now what we call hors de combat. You are outside of combat, and you become a protected person. You can be arrested, or you can be detained, and you can be brought to a camp, whatever, but you must be afforded certain rights, and you cannot be killed. And if a protected person in that instance is killed, it is indeed a war crime. Okay, let's talk now about crimes against humanity. In this field, you don't tend to have like favorite international crimes, but as I said before, this is the area of international criminal law that I think is actually far more useful than people give it credit for. One of the reasons, I'll talk about genocide, but genocide, as you know, emphasizes the destruction of the group. So the focus is on the group, yeah? That's its intellectual history. There's something particularly bad about destroying groups, and of course there is. Crimes against humanity have a different intellectual history in that what they emphasize is that some things are so bad, some crimes are so atrocious, that they're actually not just crimes against those people they're targeted against, they're crimes against all of us. They're crimes against humanity. They're crimes against what we share in common, our shared common humanity. They're also quite important because crimes against humanity can be committed in times of war and in times of peace. They're not limited to armed conflict, but still, despite this, unfortunately, sometimes they get overshadowed. So, for example, if we think about the situation in Ukraine or the situation in Gaza, really, if you read the newspapers, everybody talks about war crimes or genocide, and again, crimes against humanity aren't really discussed enough, even though, for example, in the context of Gaza, both Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, who have arrest warrants against them by the ICC, were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, and they overlap too. So, it's important to note that in order to determine that a crime against humanity has been committed, or to make the argument, there must be a widespread They must be widespread or systematic. Okay? Widespread or systematic. They do not have to be both widespread or systematic, although they often are, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. And crimes against humanity also must occur in the context of an attack on a civilian population. Now, what does an attack on a civilian population mean? According to the ICC, it means the multiple commission of acts against any civilian population pursuant to or in furtherance of a state organizational policy to commit such attack. Okay, so a policy or a plan to commit such an attack. Now, as the statute, Rome statute says, it means, and I'll list them, any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. I just want to break that down because it can get confusing. Widespread literally just means, does it happen a lot? Right? It can't be an isolated incident. Systematic typically would mean like part of a policy or a plan. Is it really put forward as something that the group committing the attack is, or the crimes against humanity is trying to achieve? Now, it says here that to commit a crime against humanity, someone must have knowledge of the attack. But the attack is not the same thing as the crime against humanity. Okay? So for example, let's say that you want to try to prosecute someone, or you believe you have a case in relation to enslavement, right? There's someone who is engaged in enslavement. You do not have to prove that that person engaged in enslavement has knowledge that enslavement is a crime against humanity. You merely have to show that they understand that enslaving a group of people is part of a broader attack against civilians. They don't need knowledge of the crime against humanity. They need knowledge that there's a general attack. There's an attack against civilians. And again, crimes against humanity as listed here: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or forcible transfer of a population. So there you have it. Even if you can't find the appropriate war crime, or the war crime doesn't necessarily fit, or the war crime does fit, you can also go for the same acts, underlying acts, forcibly transferring people, as both a war crime and a crime against humanity. You can go for the war crime of willful killing and the crime against humanity of murder. You can have both. Again, if you look at the warrants, for example, against Netanyahu, there are the same acts categorized as both war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yeah?
Just curious, can this crime be used to prosecute criminal organizations like narco groups that engage in human trafficking for the purposes of...
So again, it's a really good question, and I think a lot of people would like to use international criminal law to go after, for example, gangs or businesses or companies that engage in international crimes. However, again, as I said at the beginning, you have to go after individuals, right? So what you could do is go after the leaders of a narcotics entity or gang that was also engaged in crimes against humanity. Or if you found, for example, and there is this case right now in relation to an oil company, Swedish oil company, the guys who ran the oil company were charged with war crimes, I believe it is, the Lundin oil case. Now, you can also, but through different means, not through the ICC or this version of international criminal law, or this approach to international criminal law, also find or sue companies for complicity in certain types of international crimes, and we have seen cases of that. But that's suing, right? That's not criminal responsibility, that's seeking damages. And there have been a number of successful cases of that. Yeah.
So, speaking.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, it's fine. Perfect.
So my question is
Yeah.
enslavement. Could you discuss that a bit more? So like human trafficking of the women and children would be included in that, or is enslavement a separate sort of definition?
So human trafficking is typically understood as when it happens across borders, it's typically, in my understanding, understood as a transnational organized crime that is committed for the purposes of generating profit. I know that human trafficking is often referred to as quote unquote modern slavery, but I'm not sure. I certainly can't think of a single case where human trafficking has been brought forward as enslavement as a crime against humanity. Here, you're really, my understanding again is you would be thinking of indentured labor. You were thinking of enslavement. You were thinking of people being deprived of their liberty and then forced into various forms of labor, as opposed to being trafficked for the purposes of financial benefit. But I will talk about trafficking in a little bit, because I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. The Boko Haram, yeah. Well, and those also appear to be hostages, right? Which and Boko Haram is in an armed conflict with the government of Nigeria. I've worked with the Nigerian advocates and authorities, and for sure and then they hold them for ransom, right? Which is what you do with hostages and hostages. So, imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty. There, I think you have an argument, for example, that what has happened to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is also a crime against humanity. Imprisonment as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. Torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, etc. Also crimes against humanity. Persecution, enforced disappearances. This has never been prosecuted as a crime against humanity, but is actually the core of much of what the work that I've been doing recently, including the enforced disappearance of Indigenous children in and by Canada. Apartheid. We heard earlier the idea of gender apartheid. Apartheid is essentially full-blown structural discrimination against a particular group. We historically have known it in relation to South Africa and the structural systemic discrimination of black people. But right now, as we speak, there's an effort to try to get gender apartheid codified as a crime against humanity in a new treaty, a crime against humanity treaty. Unfortunately, as we speak, that effort, it does not look like it will be successful, and certainly hasn't been successful to date. And then you have this additional category of other inhumane acts. So to give you an example, does anybody know who this is? No? Yeah. So this is Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte. Until a couple of years ago, he was the president of the Philippines. Before that, he was the mayor of a city called Davao, and he was a police officer and really, really hated both drug users and those who sold drugs. And his response to that was to organize death squads, which literally went around different communities, first in Davao and then elsewhere, and literally just murdered them. No warrants of arrest. The numbers are staggering, maybe 10,000, maybe 20,000, maybe 30,000 people who were murdered. He was actually very open about it, said like if his police officers wouldn't do it, he would do it himself. And about 2 weeks ago, in a series of events that I don't think anybody could have predicted, he was actually surrendered to the International Criminal Court by the government of Philippines. There's lots of political reasons behind that, very unique political reasons, with a falling out between his family and the family of another former dictator of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, who's now president. But in any case, he has been sent to The Hague to face charges of crimes against humanity. And in his case, the court, the prosecutor, has alleged that those thousands of murders constitute a widespread and systematic crime against humanity. Widespread, 10,000 people is a lot of people. It's obviously widespread, right? Systematic, it was a policy of his death squads. It was his policy as a president, right? So you see that they can be both. However, it does not have to be. The Rome Statute says it can be widespread or systematic, but oftentimes, especially if you have a government or a state authorizing these crimes, you'll find that they are both widespread and systematic. So we'll see what happens with him. It'll be very interesting. Okay, let's move on. Yes?
So quick question on the
Yeah.
widespread aspect of this. So do we have a cutoff in terms of what we consider of widespread to be considered for this kind of crimes? The second one, I'm just going back to your earlier comment about you
Yeah.
mentioned that there's no really material difference between genocide and crimes against humanity. I was just wondering, in terms of punishment at the end of the day, is there a distinction between the two? Somebody who may have been engaged in crimes against humanity versus somebody who may have been confirmed to
In terms of sentencing, you mean?
genocide, yeah, sentencing or whatever, yeah.
So I would say from off the bat that there's absolutely a material difference. There's a big difference between genocide and crimes against humanity, right? Genocide focuses on the extermination with intent of the group. That's what I'll talk about in a second. And crimes against humanity requires a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. So they may overlap. All of these things to some degree overlap. It is very hard to commit genocide without committing a crime against humanity of murder, for example, or forcible transfer of a population. So these things do overlap. So I think it's good, it's useful to see them relating to each other, and overlapping, but they are distinct in how you can actually try to prove them. In terms of, whether or not one would end up in a higher sentence than the other, that's an excellent question. I would have to look at the statistics, because right now I'm not sure entirely. And there's a limit. Most international courts that deal with international crimes have a limit on how many years you can be sentenced to. I'll actually talk about a case where someone was convicted of aiding and abetting war crimes, and he was given 50 years, and I think that was the max that court could have even given him. So genocide would probably very quickly get you towards the highest, versus perhaps, other crimes against humanity might get you less, but I don't actually know. And sentencing in international criminal law is still a little bit of a moving target. We don't have that many cases, so you gotta kind of try and get into the heads of the judges, and that's not an easy thing to do. And the first question that you had was,
Widespread.
oh, whether there's a threshold. Again, you're trying to get into the head of the judges. What they would not accept is, for example, 3 murders here and then 2 years later 4 murders there, right? That's not widespread, right? That's not widespread if there's sporadic violence, right? But you will not find, to the best of my knowledge, a judge who will ever tell you, show me there's 600 in 3 months, and then I'll tell you it's widespread. They don't give you math. It's not a mathematical equation. It's an attempt to bring forward evidence that suggests that we're not talking about sporadic violence. We're not talking about moments of violence. We're talking about something more systematic or widespread. Yeah. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? Okay.
The Taliban, for example, they are killing a lot of youth. They do get, going up, and then they encourage them to do suicide. Training these kids to become a suicide. On the international way, of course, is that we don't have a nationality because they are so young, and then just doing it very much with something.
How old are they?
Depends, they have a different range from 13 all the way to 15, 16, or 17.
This is actually a good moment. I was supposed to say this. Dennis told me to say this, to make a disclaimer that nothing I say is legal advice or should be understood as such. Because, if somebody, I think for me to be responsible would actually not be for me to answer your question. It would be for me to look at evidence, information, reports, talk to people about it. Because I think one of the things that you find in international criminal law is a lot of people will be willing to stand up before an audience and say, yes, I believe that what happened to you is genocide, but they don't know. They haven't studied your situation. They haven't studied the evidence, and I think it's important to be careful. So I don't know, and it's hard for me. I try to be as responsible as possible. It took me 1.5 years to come to the conclusion that I think it's arguable that crimes against humanity in relation to the enforced disappearance of Indigenous children took place in residential schools. 1.5 years. And so I think for me to just say yes or no would elevate expectations, would make you think that I have some authority to make that claim when I don't, unless I study it carefully, right? So, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah.
Two quick questions. One is, circling back to the attack on civilians. Are there cases that you can think of when people are not in military clad uniforms, right? But they are engaged in warfare, essentially. How many cases of where that's discussed, essentially, whether they're civilians, that very often, the perpetrators will say, they were shooting at us, that's why we shot at them, essentially, but they don't, and that's just because nature of the conflict, they're not clearly identified as combatants, and so I'm wondering if there's prominent cases where that's discussed.
Yeah, I would imagine if you looked at a case like Syria, right, where the belligerents include various terrorist organizations. They do not wear military, right? They don't wear military garb or insignia. So anywhere where there's irregular troops like that, or irregular belligerents, I should say, they're not troops, would be a good example to look at.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through cases where it's been argued that the civilians are obviously being impacted, and it's not just. So yeah, Syria would be a good place to start. Yeah, and another question was just around protected spaces. You were talking about a clinic that was used for civilian purposes, and then if the military comes in, you can say that it loses its protected status. But if you have both happen, it may. So that was my question: is if it's potentially both. So if you have it's still being used as a clinic, but you also have military that's come in at the same time, what happens? How does that get kind of question?
So if there is a situation where, for example, two belligerents are in a hospital of 60 people, the entity that is thinking about attacking the hospital has to, I didn't actually put these in my slides. I presented this to my partner before I came, and she's like, that's too complicated. You don't talk about the principles of international humanitarian law. But there are principles of international humanitarian law, including proportionality. Again, not a perfect science, but 60 civilians for one terrorist or one belligerent is probably not proportional. 3 civilians for one military leader, maybe, right? So you have to consider that. You have to consider proportionality. You have to consider military necessity. Is it militarily necessary in order to target this hospital or clinic, right? And if it's not, then you can't. Are the people who are belligerents inside of the hospital actively engaged in armed conflict? If they are seeking medical attention and have left their armed conflict, they may become protected persons. They are no longer susceptible to being attacked in the hospital. And then, of course, there's the principle. I mean, there's a number of principles, but one includes the fact that those engaged in military operations must take all precautions to protect civilian life. So, if you know that there are 2 terrorists and 25 civilians in a hospital, and you drop a giant bomb on top, you have not taken all precautions to ensure that civilian death was minimized. If those people are operating and you walk into the hospital and perhaps detain or take the militants away, maybe you have actually engaged in a way that is both proportional and also is attempting to make that distinction and take precautions to avoid civilian life. Yeah, and so it can get very complicated, because you have to apply these principles to each one, because just civilian death is not a war crime. It is an odd thing about international humanitarian law that it does not criminalize or make illegal civilian death. It just seeks to minimize the harm to civilians.
So I'm not continue your presentation. I think question after, or I want to ask it. I have a long question, so I can ask it later.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, shall we do it because we are let's finish this 4 steps
Yeah.
and then we get more questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Mark has to leave at 3:30 because he has a flight to Vancouver, and we want to make sure that we got all the materials that he prepared. So let's just finish on that, and if we have time left.
I think there'll be time, because it's, what time is it? It's 2:20?
It's 2.
Yeah, I think there will be time, and the reason I'm going back is because my poor students have an exam tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's talk about genocide. And then, yeah, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, of course. And I think we'll definitely have time. So, unlike crimes against humanity, the focus, as you know, of genocide is the specific group, right? And genocide law really emerges from the Genocide Convention. Now, the Genocide Convention is something that states sign, so breaches of the Genocide Convention are things that states can sue each other for. Like, for example, South Africa and Israel, or the Gambia has taken Myanmar to the International Court of Justice for breaches of genocide in relation to the Rohingya people. You know that there are lots of cases, right? We have the Holocaust, Rwanda, Darfur, Srebrenica, the Rohingya, Gaza, where there's an alleged genocide, Canada against the indigenous people, etc. But when we're talking about international criminal law, let's remember again that we're focusing on individual criminal responsibility. Now, when I teach my students and give lectures on genocide, particularly in Canada, I often ask people to close their eyes and to think about, what does genocide look like to you? And typically, the answers that I get are something like mass murder, mass graves, mass piles of deceased persons, mass something, spectacular violence, in your face, large scale violence. It is important to know that can be genocidal. This is what we often call the Holocaust paradigm, or the Rwandan genocide paradigm. Large scale, spectacular violence. However, per both the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, genocide is not limited to spectacular violence. One of the things that genocide scholars have been trying to get us to better understand in the world is that genocide is not an event. Genocide is a process. Genocide takes time. Genocide can often happen very slowly. And the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute tell us how. Yes, it includes killing members of the group. Yes, it includes causing bodily or mental harm. But it also includes deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. The conditions of life, denying people, a particular group of people, a defined group of people, food over a long period of time. Denying them the necessities of life. As long as it is done in order to destroy the group in whole or in part, with that intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, that can be genocidal violence. Imposing measures pretended to prevent births within the group. Denying the group the ability to have new members of the group can be genocidal. And that doesn't fit our idea of large-scale mass murder. And forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, right? Think of indigenous children who are forced out of indigenous communities to be adopted, for example, by white families. Or think of the example that was given of Ukrainian children being transferred from Ukrainian orphanages and other places to Russian families. That can constitute an act of genocide, again, if the intent exists to commit those acts to destroy the group in whole or in part. So, the acts matter, but with genocide, the intent is critical. It cannot just be one of these 5 acts. They must be accompanied by the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. Now, importantly, motivation for genocide is not legally relevant. To give you an example, when you talk or when I talk, or when I listen to some people deny that genocide happened against Indigenous people in Canada, you will hear a version of a story which says, we wanted to help them, we tried to help them, it was about educating them, we were benevolent, we were trying to save them from their whatever it is, right? This myth of benevolence. It doesn't matter. Genocide law is completely silent on the motive or motivation that people have. All that matters is the intent. What is the desired outcome of a certain action? So if you use education or re-education, right, and you think that's the greatest thing you could possibly do, and your motive is to help people, or you think it's to help people, but you are helping people in order to destroy them as the particular group that they are, you have committed genocide. And it does not matter that your motive was benevolent or that you thought it was benevolent. It's very important. People get that confused. And so you'll often hear from people pretending that something isn't a genocide or denying genocide. They'll focus on motive, not an intent. They'll tell you that the motive was good and therefore it can't be genocidal. It's not correct. It's not correct. They're two separate things. The other thing that is interesting is the International Court of Justice has noted that while mass numbers of deceased or killed people may be helpful in understanding genocidal violence, it is not always a requirement of a finding of genocide that you have large numbers. You may have a very small group of people, or you may target a very important segment of a group of people, and by killing them or by harming, by targeting them with genocidal acts, you may have destroyed the group in whole or in part. It does not have to be tens of thousands or millions of people. It does not have to be mass murder. This is important. Again, if there is mass murder at that extent, it may be indicative of genocidal violence, but it is not a legal requirement. Okay. And finally, we have the crime of aggression, which has its roots in Nuremberg. I don't think any of the contexts in which you are working on are contexts of interstate war, right? No, I don't think I heard of any. So it's not as relevant because only state leaders can commit a crime of aggression against another state. The classic examples are the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The crime of aggression is basically the commission of illegal warfare as a crime, organizing the illegal invasion effectively of another country. The Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946 actually found that the crime of aggression, or what it called crime against peace, was the supreme crime, but that's because what it basically was trying to articulate is that no other crimes, no other war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, or whatever you may think of, is possible unless a state invades another state. Now our emphasis typically around the world is on internal conflicts, and so are civil wars, and so it's not quite as relevant. Yeah.
From the international, ICC perspective, criminal court perspective, which one would be more easier to establish, genocide or crimes against humanity? When you look at the key elements, which one would be neither?
I mean, again, I don't want to give anybody false hope, but what I will say is that I believe, it is my personal belief, that establishing intent for genocide is the most difficult thing to achieve in international criminal law.
Okay.
And this is, I think, verified by the fact that at the ICC there's only ever been one arrest warrant for genocide, and the guy is still at large. And a number of other courts have hesitated to prosecute genocide, and when they have, it's been because they have what we call a smoking gun, such good proof of that intent. The gold standard for proof of intent, by the way, is a document that says we're targeting these people with this level of violence to destroy their group. That is very rare these days.
Okay, and I have to make a legal disclaimer for everyone. Sorry for that. The information provided here and during the presentations are for general informational purposes only and does not constitute a legal advice. No attorney-client relationship here is created by accessing, using, or relying on this contact. We make no representations and warranties, express or implied, regarding the accuracy, completeness, and reliability of the information. You should seek the advice of a qualified legal professional for guidance on any specific legal matter. We express this claim and all liability arising from the use and reliance of this information. So we had to do that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so now you know that you can't take what I say and build your cases, but I would stand by the claim that finding genocidal intent is probably the hardest thing. It's just very difficult to establish. Now, again, it's not particularly relevant to the context you are working on, but I just wanted to share this because I think it's, I come from a background where international crimes were also committed, including against my family in Poland. And one of the ways that my family has coped is through humor. They're Eastern Europeans, and sometimes they find ways to laugh in the midst of even horrific violence. And does anybody know what this says? Okay. So this is a road sign in Ukraine from March of 2022. And it's on a highway between Russia and Ukraine. As you get into Ukraine, and obviously what people have done is they've taken out all of the actual places for directions, right? And the reason they did that is because it was the Russian military taking this road, yeah? So they would have had to see this sign. And they've replaced every single town and village on the sign with The Hague. Which I thought was very, very, very funny and a great moment of resistance. A good reminder of where perpetrators should go. Okay, so those are the 4 core international crimes. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. Now, I wanted to make a plug for understanding that none of these core international crimes happen alone. We have found over and over again that core international crimes are part of a constellation of harms and illegal activities. What I have found in my own research, for example, is that, and I seriously can't think of a single example where this isn't true since World War II, is that perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide are often, if not always, at the very same time, also engaged in transnational organized crime. They are trying to find or establish ways to make money, to profit off of the commission of international crimes, or they find international crimes helpful in achieving profits. For example, controlling certain mineral wealth, or controlling, for example, passages across various borders. Here you might think of human or sex trafficking, drug trafficking, money laundering. They're often engaged in these very same crimes at the same time. And a great example of this is this guy. Does anybody know who this guy is? This is Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor was the president of Liberia. Now, he sponsored and engaged in a whole series of wars and war crimes in Sierra Leone, in neighboring Sierra Leone. Ultimately, the war ended, and long story short, they set up the special court for Sierra Leone, and Charles Taylor was convicted many years later. I actually went to his trial. I'll never forget it, because I went to his trial, and he looked at me. It was the first time I'd ever seen someone on trial like that, but anyways. So he was ultimately convicted of aiding and abetting war crimes. And he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. I said I think 50 years is about the max that you'll see. But aiding and abetting. He was not actually convicted of himself directly committing any war crimes. He just simply aided and abetted the commission. How? He did it through the unlawful sale of conflict minerals, what many people call blood diamonds. He sold those around the world in order to gain money And he used a lot of that money to fuel the conflict in Sierra Leone in order to then make more money by stealing more minerals, by controlling more mines. His conviction for aiding and abetting war crimes only happens if we understand him as someone engaged in transnational organized crimes. And there he is while he was on trial at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and actually his trial was at a special courtroom seconded by the International Criminal Court. So, very briefly, actually, just, yeah. Oh, you want to come in quick? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Now we have 10 minutes break and then we come back after 10 minutes break. Have your coffees and join us.
10 minutes? Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
10 minutes we come back.
Sounds good. No. That sounds good. Okay. This is a good place to start.
So it was funny.
Yeah. more opportunity for questions if you have them. And this second part is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I really want to emphasize, some of the insights that have been generated in relation to investigating and gathering evidence of international crimes. To do that, I think it's first important to recognize that the answer to this question, where is justice for international crimes best served, is not the ICC, is not internationally. It is actually domestically. The gold standard really is to have national courts be competent to investigate international crimes. The organization I work for, the YAMO Foundation, really does try to do that. We train investigators and prosecutors from around the world, and particularly in the sub-Saharan African context, to investigate and prosecute crimes within their own court system. And indeed, this is an example of that happening. People watching or waiting to watch a trial take place last year, or just over a year ago, in Guinea, where the former junta leader, the former effectively acting president junta leader, was prosecuted for crimes, atrocities relating to a 2009 stadium massacre in Conakry, the capital of Guinea. And this was the gold standard of people being held to account close to where victims were, close to where the crimes were. Now, of course, the reason why we have the International Criminal Court and other international bodies like hybrid courts, like the one that I mentioned that was set up for Charles Taylor and others, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, is because the domestic system is often not capable of addressing international crimes. It is often, targeted by violence. If you think of a context, many contexts around the world, often war actually fundamentally destroys the justice system. Rwanda after the 1994 genocide, right? It did not have a viable court system. In other instances, you may not want to go to national authorities because the national authorities are the ones who have committed the atrocities themselves, and so you may have a functioning justice system, but that functionality is actually just to protect the state from accountability. So that's when we seek to go to the International Criminal Court. These, by the way, are windows of the ICC in its new building in The Hague. I still remember when it was built, some people really like the windows. They think it's nice. Other people think they look like tiling in a toilet or a washroom somewhere. So that's the joke about the ICC's premises. But I actually think if you go there, they kind of look, they do kind of look like tiles, but they also look kind of nice. Now, there is another way that people can go to advocate for justice and accountability for international crimes to national courts, and that's through the national courts of other states. Under the principle of universal jurisdiction, some states can in fact investigate and prosecute international crimes as well as transnational organized crimes, even if they are committed in another country, and even if they are committed by perpetrators of that other country against victims of that other country. So just to give an example of this, in the 2010s, Canada prosecuted 2 individuals for their involvement in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Now, those individuals committed their alleged atrocities. One was acquitted, one was convicted. But for the one that was convicted, he had committed his atrocities in Rwanda against Rwandans while being a Rwandan, right? But he was prosecuted in Canadian courts under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And I'll talk about a new case on that in a minute, in a couple minutes. And then finally, the ICC can only take so many cases. It's quite limited. People are working to set up new kinds of courts, domestic courts or hybrid courts. Sorry, a mix of the domestic and international elements which create, hybrid courts. So hybrid courts are courts that take some international staff and some national staff, for example, some international law and potentially some domestic law. So I mentioned the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Right now, Liberia, the country of Liberia, is working to create what it's calling the War Crimes and Economic Crimes Court. Very interesting to bring in economic crimes into the ambit of a tribunal. The Gambia is in the process of setting up a hybrid court, etc. So it is possible to actually have different courts other than the International Criminal Court on that international level. Now, I only mention that, I think in in your next seminar, in 2 seminars, you'll focus on the institutions, and there's lots of them, and people will walk you through them. So I wanted to really turn towards this idea of evidence collection and gathering. Now, historically, in international criminal law, this is what would happen. There'd be a mass atrocity event or a war where atrocities were committed, and the world would say, we got to do something about this. We got to set up a court. We got to find the political will to set up a court. Then the court would be set up, hopefully. Then the court would have judges and prosecutors and staff appointed. Maybe some of them would be national, maybe some of them would be international. And then they would start investigations, and then they would prosecute people if they had cases, okay? Now, the problem with this model is that it suggests that you need the institution to be in place, the court to be in place, the bricks and mortars to be in place before you actually start collecting evidence and doing the work of gathering information that could be used at trial. This is no longer what happens. We no longer expect to wait for a court to be set up to start investigating and collecting evidence. Now, and I'll give an example of that in relation to Syria. But it's important to recognize that when we're thinking of international criminal law and the evidence that we use to prove international crimes, it is fundamentally different than the evidence that's put forward for human rights violations. For human rights violations, you can describe what has happened. You can document what's happened. For international crimes, we have to gather what is called linkage evidence. The evidence that links an atrocity event, a murder, a crime against humanity, or a war crime, whatever it may be, to a specific individual and says, this individual is responsible for that event. Human rights organizations might just say, this event happened and we saw these planes or we saw these people, this is a human rights violation. International criminal law investigators have to say, this happened, we saw this happen, we understand that, but we have to link what happened to an individual who's responsible for making those atrocities occur. So we follow the evidence, right? We follow the evidence, hopefully up the chain of the command, to the people who are most responsible. That's the goal, right? And it's important to note that the linkage evidence, when properly collected, might bring you to someone who's never stepped foot in the areas where the atrocities have happened, right? Vladimir Putin does not go to Ukraine to commit atrocities, but he is ultimately responsible. And so we have to link what is happening in Ukraine all the way up that chain of command. Now the other thing is that a good investigator doesn't just focus on crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or genocide. Tries to understand what on earth is happening and gather as much information as possible. And you might gather information on human rights violations. Or maybe you'll gather information on transnational organized crimes like the trafficking of wildlife goods or the trafficking of individuals or other types of violations or money laundering. Or maybe you'll find out that there's a little bit of corruption happening here. You'll find out different pieces of evidence, right? Because what you want when we're starting out these investigations is to just try to gather as much information as possible. And if in the process of doing that, you have all of this information, some of which might relate to an atrocity crime or an international crime, but some of which doesn't, that's okay. That other stuff is still really valuable. Does anybody know who this is? Okay. Hey? Yes. This is Al Capone. Okay? This is an American mobster. He was involved in a whole series of murders. Does anybody know what he was convicted of? Tax evasion. Tax evasion. Okay? This man was responsible and involved in many murders. prosecutors didn't feel comfortable, I guess, in bringing those murder charges against him. But they did find evidence that he had been involved in tax evasion. And he went to jail. He went to Alcatraz. He was convicted of tax evasion. Now, had those prosecutors just said, I'm only focusing on murder, they wouldn't have arrested and got him convicted and thrown into jail. The victims of his murders don't get full justice, but they do get to know that Al Capone had to go to jail. And that really matters. And it's the same thing. If we find evidence that someone is involved in organ trafficking, but you also think they're involved in genocidal violence, but your information is better on organ trafficking, make sure you try and get them for organ trafficking, right? Try to get them on that other stuff. If you have a good corruption case, yes, the person might be involved in war crimes, but if you got a good corruption case, get the corruption case. Al Capone them. Get them off the streets. Stop them from being allowed or free to commit these types of crimes. Now, I mentioned Syria because Syria is really where the international community and advocates of justice and accountability for international crimes figure out that we can investigate international crimes before courts are set up. And the reason is, as many of you will probably remember, and when the civil war started in 2011, there were various attempts to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court. Russia said no, China said no. You couldn't send investigators into Syria because it was a civil war. The ICC therefore couldn't investigate either, as I just mentioned. So what happened? People were like, we're not giving up. We're not just giving up on these thousands and millions of people subjected to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some instances for the Yazidis, genocide. So one thing that happened was a private NGO called the Commission for Justice and Accountability actually trained Syrians to smuggle out documentary evidence. And they did that, and they continue to do that, as I understand, and have done so for almost 13 years now. A couple of years ago, the former US Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues, Stephen Rapp, noted that thanks to those efforts, but also thanks to open source evidence, evidence on the internet, which I'll focus on for the rest, for the last bit of this lecture, he said that there was more evidence of mass atrocities and international crimes in Syria, better evidence, than there was even for the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial. Amazing. No court. There's never been a court set up to address international crime in Syria. But what has happened is people have documented and preserved evidence and collected that evidence. One other significant contribution is that because there was a UN Security Council deadlock in relation to addressing international crimes in Syria, the UN General Assembly set up the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to investigate international crimes in Syria. Later, they created a very similar one for atrocities committed against the Rohingya. This body exists to this day and has collected and preserved evidence. It hasn't just done that, though. Both it and the private NGO that I mentioned have actually shared that evidence with European jurisdictions willing to use it to prosecute individuals who left Syria after perpetrating crimes, pretending to be refugees. There's Syria, the little yellow thing. And there are just some of the situations and countries that have actually prosecuted perpetrators from Syria. Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, United States. Typically what happened was that once the civil war started, you had 1 million or 2 million, I forget the exact number, people flee Syria. Sometimes the people who fled Syria were actually perpetrators. And people in Germany and elsewhere, victims, survivors, would spot the people who had committed atrocities and say, this person should be prosecuted. And those countries could do it because they had the ability to exercise, as I mentioned, universal jurisdiction. Excellent. Thank you very much. Critically important, had they waited for a court to be set up, none of this would have been possible. There wouldn't have been the evidence in play. And now, as you know, a couple of months ago, something that no one could have predicted was going to happen, the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapsed, incredibly. And I'm not here to tell you that everything's going to be okay in Syria. It probably won't be. It has a long way to go. But you know what happened? the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court went to Damascus to meet with the new leaders. 15 years after the civil war started, the chief prosecutor is in discussions with the new government in Syria to potentially open finally an investigation. And thank God people collected that evidence. Because now they're not starting with having to go back and investigate. They have 14 years of information. Indeed, it's estimated too, in relation to open source evidence, that there are more hours documenting the war in Syria on YouTube than there are hours that have passed since the Syrian civil war started in 2011. Which brings me to the importance of open source evidence. This is really where a lot of the action on investigating and gathering evidence of international crimes is going and is right now. And the reason is that there has never ever been, as Bellingcat, an organization that does this work, there's never ever been more information, disinformation, misinformation, or evidence of international crimes out there in the public on the internet. On people's phones, on people's laptops. It is challenging, but not impossible, to differentiate between what is fake information, fake videos, fake photographs, and real photographs that actually amount to evidence. And there are dedicated groups, like Mnemonic, that works in Syria and works elsewhere, that actually collect this evidence and seek to verify its authenticity and then preserve it. So that, again, they don't know if somebody's going to be able to use this in a year or in 10 years, but if somebody is able to use that evidence to prosecute someone at some point, it's there, it's preserved, it's ready to go. And what we find over and over again is that both perpetrators and victims carry online, on their phones, or post evidence of international crimes. It is one of the most remarkable trends of the last 15 years, just how often perpetrators in particular put evidence of their own crimes onto the internet. I'll give you two examples. Okay. One is from a case called the Prosecutor versus Site. This is a case that happened in Sweden in relation to Syria. The defendant, who was being prosecuted for alleged war crimes, participated in the war between ISIS and Iraq. So it's not just Syria, it's actually specifically in relation to Iraq. Now, he posted photographs on Facebook of himself next to dead bodies, including some that had been desecrated. This is ISIS did this like no one else did. They recorded their own atrocities and put them out. And again, I'll give you another example of that here in Canada in a minute. Now, the police investigated him because he posted this horrific image. I guess someone reported it, started investigating it. They found the same image on his USB flash drive, which meant that he had it in his possession, and brought them closer to probably what I assume is the original photo. Not a duplication, not a screenshot of a screenshot of a screenshot, not a tweet of a retweet of a retweet, or an X, I guess, whatever it is. But probably the original, right? They got close to the original. So they charged him with war crimes. Now, how did they convict them? Well, you can't just use open source evidence. You have to get experts to verify that it's real. And experts on what was in the image and on imaging itself testified that the images had not been manipulated, that the body was probably a real body. It's a weird thing about testifying to images, but you actually have to get people to actually say things like, that is the way that blood would flow if someone was cut that way. So I can say with 99% certainty that that's blood, not red dye, right? Because red dye would have too much water and wouldn't flow in the same way, right? But you have to get people, you have to get experts to tell the court what is in the images itself. And the experts said, these are authentic. These have not been manipulated, and those are dead bodies. We believe that those are dead bodies. And he was convicted of war crimes, specifically subjecting bodies to humiliating and degrading treatment. A successful prosecution where an online post was the star evidence. Another case, the Prosecutor versus Omar Haizam. Here, an Islamic fighter, he wasn't part of ISIS, was found on video with captured Syrian government soldiers who were subsequently executed in the video, okay? So you have a video, not an image. Specialists are brought in, and they say, yes, we find that this video is authentic, right? It's not a green screen, it's an authentic video. Now something really interesting happened. You had this video, again, it's not good enough on its own. And the defendant says, look, yeah, I killed those Syrian government soldiers, but I did so after a court system that I was living under sentenced them to death. So all I was doing was executing them in line with a court sentence, okay? So what do? Well, what they did is they got technicians or experts to come in to do shadow analysis. People who could read the shadows cast in the video in order to make a timeline of events. And what they ultimately found was that the longest period of time that could have been possible between between what the person claimed was the court's order to execute and the execution was 1.5 days to 41 hours. And they did that based on understanding the shadows inside of the open source video. That's what they used. And what they found then is if it's only 1.5 days or 41 hours between a court saying this person should be executed and the execution taking place, that's not legitimate. You can't do that. That's not a lawful procedure. That's not okay. That remains a violation of international humanitarian law. It remains a war crime. And he was convicted. Has anybody seen this image? It's been in the newspapers here in Canada. This is Ahmed El-Didi. I mentioned before that Canada did these 2 Rwandan cases under universal jurisdiction. It then completely stopped until Ahmed El-Didi. Last May, literally 11 months ago, Ahmed El-Didi got Canadian citizenship. Within a couple of months, he was arrested with his son, depicted here. He was arrested with his son for planning a terrorist attack in Toronto. Maybe some of you remember, it was pretty big news. Within 3 days, France had apparently tipped off Canadian authorities and the RCMP that they were aware of a video that was online. It was in the public on a website called Jihadology. An ISIS video which allegedly depicts Ahmed El-Didi interrogating someone in an orange jumpsuit and then maiming them, basically cutting off parts of their arms and whatnot. Yeah, pretty gruesome stuff. The RCMP charged Ahmed El-Didi initially with aggravated assault, which is, I hope everybody recognizes, a little bit ridiculous. Aggravated assault is like hitting someone with a pool cue at a bar. It's not interrogating someone in a war context and then, basically destroying their body and killing them. And last November, Canada, the RCMP charged Ahmed El-Didi, took away the aggravated assault charge, and charged Ahmed El-Didi with 4 separate war crimes. And he will be prosecuted for a war crime that's believed to have happened in northern Iraq in a Canadian court. And the star of that trial will be the open source video evidence that was put forward of his atrocities, or his alleged atrocities, I should say, and again, the experts that can tell us what exactly is happening in that video. Is that really happening? Is it authentic? Etc. Remarkable. This is where things are going. Finally, I don't know if I think this is going to be, at least with the Magnitsky Act, in one of your future sessions. But I wanted to return to the theme of linking different types of crimes. When you see senior types of perpetrators, the people who are most responsible, the organizers, you will find that they are not just engaged in atrocities. They are making money. They are involved in corruption. They are selling stuff illegally across borders, like transnational organized crimes, committing transnational organized crimes. And they make money off that, and they have assets because of that. And in Canada, as you'll see in a couple of sessions from now, Canada has laws to deal with some of these things and try to seize the assets of some people involved in human rights violations and international crimes specifically through the Special Economic Measures Act. Unlike any other country in the world, and it's still early days, we'll see how this goes, it's very complicated. Under the Special Economic Measures Act, Canada can freeze, seize, and unlike any other country in the world right now, as far as I know, it can actually repurpose the assets. It can take the assets away and give them back to the states or potentially people who were hurt by those crimes. Have you seen this plane? This plane is at Pearson. This is an Antonov plane that has been grounded at Pearson since February 22nd of 2022, when Canada closed its airspace to Russian aircrafts after the second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. This aircraft has been frozen as an asset. It's stayed there ever since. And then Canada has moved to seize it, and again, we'll see how this develops, but the goal appears to be to actually repurpose the plane and return it to Ukraine or sell it and give the money back to Ukraine so that Ukraine can rebuild the roads that were destroyed, rebuild the hospitals and homes that were destroyed. This is huge, huge. I just finished a project for the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, specifically on the plane and other assets held by Canada. I'm also trying to do this work in relation to Sudan with my colleagues at the Wayamo Foundation. International criminal law is really important. We want perpetrators of international crimes to be held accountable. But we also have to think about the universe in which their crimes are made possible. And one of those things is money and assets. They profit from these things. They take money from good people. What we're trying to do, at least, is to think about how it's possible that in a country like Sudan that has so much gold, atrocities are being perpetrated. Well, where's the money going? What banks are getting the money? Where's the money flowing? It's definitely not going to be in Sudan. Sudan's in a very large-scale, brutal civil war. And we're looking at different jurisdictions. I can't share with you now, but we're looking at different jurisdictions and different countries that have banks to hopefully identify assets that have been taken out of Sudan by perpetrators. Why? Because yes, I think it's important that we pursue prosecution, but it's also important that we repair the damage to victims and survivors of international crimes. And hopefully we think that if we do both of those things, that people can be prosecuted one day for atrocities in Sudan, and victims and survivors can get compensation and reparations for what they experienced from the very people who stole the wealth of their own countries from them. If we do that, if we understand that those core international crimes I've talked about exist in this universe of corruption, transnational organized crimes, human rights violations, whatever it may be, petty murder, if we think about that Al Capone method, we might not always be able to get the ICC or international courts to convict and prosecute them, and even if we do, it'll take a long time. But if we start seeing that universe of criminality and criminal conduct that these people are involved in, we can at least disrupt their ability to continue committing these crimes. And disruption is key. When we don't have the courts, or when it looks like it'll take a decade, let's at least try to disrupt them. Now, I know from listening to victims and survivors in other contexts, and maybe you feel the same way, that it does sometimes feel like we're being pulled in all these different directions. My lecture probably felt a little bit like I was pulling you in all these different directions, right? It's a lot, and there's a lot of crap right now, and the world isn't an easy place. Sometimes it has me feeling like this, at a bus stop in the middle of the field, not knowing where I'm going to go. It's hard, and I get that, and I'm sure for those of you working on these issues, it is hard, and my heart is with you for continuing to try. But I wanted to return to this theme of sunlight. Things are hard, just like concrete is hard. But there are cracks, and in those cracks, flowers sometimes grow. And it's quite a beautiful thing. Flowers are beautiful in general, but flowers that persist, that resist the toughness of life and the world, are perhaps among the most beautiful. So I wanted to leave you with the words of Benjamin Ferencz. He was the last living prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. He died a couple of years ago. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being. Very short, but very wonderful. Like very, very, very short. It was an incredible person whose mantra was law, not war. And he said, and I think about these words very often, he said, the world is full of good people who do good deeds. Sometimes just remembering that and holding on to it can be enough to rally us, inspire us, and make us feel better about the history we are living through. Don't think easy versus difficult. If it's a question of right versus wrong, then follow what's right, right? Let's follow what's right. Let's be that little flower breaking through the concrete. And in doing that, I wanted to just return finally to this theme that if we are constantly measuring our success or our value on the basis of convictions or particular outcomes, we'll miss something. We'll miss the fact that we're here together having these conversations. We'll miss the fact that there is justice in the pursuit of justice, because the pursuit of justice articulates this is what happened, and I believe you. I believe victims and survivors. And I believe that the pursuit itself of justice is in and of itself an act of justice. And I think it's an important thing to remember looking out at an audience that I know is working very hard at the pursuit of justice for the context you're working in. What you are doing is in and of itself already an act of justice. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful talk. Thanks, Marcus and Mr. Marcus. It was really great, insightful talk. And Mark just walked up through the core international crimes, war crimes, crime against humanity, genocide, and crime of aggression. Also, he actually gave us an example of how documentation is very important. An example was Syria, and I think for the victim it's very important to work on that. I think this is a good lesson to learn, that we really need actually put our all sources together and we'll work with the people on the ground and here to have that documentation. And also the last thing is not just rely on the international criminal court. We have a domestic court like in Canada. We had a few examples which Mark clearly mentioned. This is an opportunity as well. If we know some of the perpetrators in Canada or elsewhere, then this is something we can actually build a case against them and we can work with it. We have another 5 minutes if you don't mind for one or two questions.
Yes, Mark, can I ask you a question? We have a bunch of not-for-profit organizations here, and we talk a lot about evidence collection. What do you recommend to not-for-profit organizations in terms of collecting evidence? For example, if there is a victim, should they videotape it? Testimony, like what should they do? What specific evidence you were talking about when you advise us that you should preserve and collect evidence?
Shall we take one or two more questions and then you? Sure. Can I have some piece of paper? Anyone else have got a question? Yes, please. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. My question is with regard to Israel specifically. Many experts in the field have determined or feel that what happened in Israel is criminal. And I'm wondering, in case of Israel, committed primarily by the federal government and local affairs. And so in terms of, I believe Ethiopia is a signatory of the ICC. And so specifically for Tigray, what steps we can take or steps can we take to make sure that this is moved forward and we get justice? And we have the evidence, and I know if you probably know that the New Line Institute report, in fact, says that it's likely to be a genocide. So I just want to sort of in a high level, what sort of in our situation where Ethiopia is not signatory, what types of steps?
Thank you. We take one more question and then we wait for Mark to respond and then we come to the next. Yes, please.
there are many representatives of different communities here, and because it's being live streamed as well, I just want to make a little comment and also want to get your insights about one specific subject. So there is a specific case in Turkey. There's a movement called Hizmet movement, and they've been targeted by the government of Turkey since like 2013, especially after 2016. They were scapegoated for masterminding the coup attempt in Turkey, and millions of people have been targeted as a terrorist. Like the organization called as a terrorist organization by the government, designated as a terrorist organization, and the people who are sympathizers or members of that organization, the movement, were regarded as terrorists, so terrorist sympathizers. That group is a social group, education-centered social group, and they have schools in more than like 160 countries, and hundreds and thousands of people have been directly and indirectly impacted. Like, I'm curious, like we were talking about like slaughtering people, like killing people, but knowing the Uyghur case, where people are targeted for their culture and religion, and as far as I know, Canada designated the Uyghur case as a genocide. So I'm just curious, like what can a social group who is targeted by the government to be like totally dismantled, and you cannot even say I'm a sympathizer of that movement, even though it's not a terrorist organization. What can that movement do? And there are many representatives of that community in Western countries, including Canada, Europe, and the refugees, and many people are in Turkey. What can they do, and what kind of criteria that we can say to designate as a social genocide, for example?
Thank you. Mark?
You already covered it. Sure. Okay. You please. Does this, no? No. Sorry. I'll take the last two questions because they're in some ways similar, although, and I would actually suggest, conversations because Tigray and what you're describing about in Turkey are, similar in the sense that you can't go to, there's no ICC case, there's no avenues to the ICC, etc. And you're asking, what to do. The question, just for the last point, the Genocide Convention is restricted to particular kinds of groups and doesn't include, for example, political groups, right, or political supporters of a group, right? It's religious, ethnic, etc. Groups. All I can say is that some people think that should be expanded. Other people think that it shouldn't be expanded. And so, it's hard for me to stand here because I don't know enough about the Turkey case. But, I would continue to try to, if it was me, I guess I would try to figure out, what other possible violations of international law are at play here. I think we have seen quite understandably over the last 20 years that when there are atrocities happening, the primary interest of many advocacy groups is to try to articulate it as a genocide. And I think that's because the way that genocide is covered is that if you get a finding of genocide, this world has to do something about it. And so there is this desire to articulate things as being genocidal. Again, I think completely understandably. My viewpoint and advice probably to everybody, no matter where they are in the world, is to also think about crimes against humanity. In Turkey, you can't have war crimes. In Tigray, war crimes do apply because it was an internal armed conflict. But what about crimes against humanity here? What other types of atrocities have happened that perhaps... Look, I actually think that crimes against humanity in some ways more granular because you saw all of the different things that can be crimes against humanity, whereas genocide has these 5 specific acts. And so it's sometimes hard to fit them in unless you have killing or unless you have conditions of life. And if you don't have those things, then it can't be genocidal. Or if you haven't fit into the definition of groups, then it can't be genocidal. I don't think that's the end of the story. I think that there are other crimes listed in international criminal law that remain relevant. And I often encourage people to think through the nuances that are available and the jurisprudence, the cases that are available in relation to crimes against humanity. That's not really a particularly useful or good answer, but that's the one I got. on Tigrayan steps, I mean, it's the same for somewhat similar. I mean, what should you do? You should do exactly what you're doing. You know, advocate for greater understanding. Try to get the media to cover what is occurring. I also think, and again, I don't know enough about Tigray, but I think that there is and we were talking about it earlier at breakfast. You know, when I think about the context that I'm working in, and I'll just share that, and then if that's relevant to you, then I'll just fingers crossed. There are a lot of private entities that are involved in context of mass atrocities, mining companies, including some Canadian ones that have been sued for their involvement in what amounts to atrocities, right? In places like Ethiopia. A Canadian mining company was sued for crimes against humanity in Canada for a mining operation in Eritrea, right? The Nevsun case. We see other cases in Guatemala of this. I think one thing that I encourage people to do, and I think this would be my only takeaway, is not think that you want to define something and therefore try and find everything to fit into that box. Try to see all of the different threads of problematic behavior. Try to map out the actors that are involved or that are on the ground. Private actors, state actors, who's actually involved? What are they getting for their involvement in atrocities? Do some form of, I think this is more and more the norm, to try to do some kind of mapping exercise to find out what is possible and where you can identify avenues for justice and accountability. I don't think it is, and I'm not alone in this, I think that the way that people have often, and I'm not saying anyone's like this in this room, but you do often see that it's like ICC or nothing. The ICC or nothing position is not a particularly useful way to try to achieve justice and accountability. We have to be more creative. We have to be more thoughtful. We have to understand these things as a network of criminal conduct and harms and try to do anything we can. And I think the mapping of those, harms, mapping of what's happening, mapping which actors, private and non-private, are involved, can allow us to do this thing, which is seize the opportunity the moment it comes. If somebody enters into Canada, but you've mapped out that they're involved in some transnational organized crimes or international crimes or whatever it is that you mapped out, bring that forward because you have the opportunity, because you already have that information. And then maybe someone has that information on their phone or it's on YouTube or whatever, and start building these cases. But I think the only advice I'd really have is to think big so that when the opportunity arises, you can focus on the narrow rather than the opposite, which often happens, which is think narrow, try to fit everything into this singular viewpoint on genocide or a particular type of crime when you're not seeing the rest. And the rest might actually be where you can disrupt that international criminal law, that international crime activity. And I think that's what we're trying to do. That's really trying to focus on disruption of international crimes and encouraging states to use universal jurisdiction. And then advice for evidence collection, above all, be safe. Do not do anything that puts yourselves or anyone else at risk when it comes to engaging in any form of evidence collection. I mean, that's so important. And then the second thing I would say is whether, mnemonic is an organization. There's Bellingcat. There is the Berkeley Protocol on open source investigations. There's all of this information out there on how best to investigate international crimes and other offenses using online platforms. And I think I always would say the first thing people should do if they want to start doing this work is get trained to do this work, right? Get trained to do this work. It is not an easy thing being an investigator of international crimes, so getting training by the right types of people is critical. Thank you.
Let's join me for thanks again to Mark Persson for his really remarkable, presentation. We really learn a lot. And I think as you are running to the airport, it's 3:35. Probably we actually ended up in here. But later on, people has got some questions. Probably they can email you.
Of course.
Or, we can have a more interaction.
Can we get the presentation?
The slide, sure.
That's what I was.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
you will get that.
You have them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. And thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
At this stage, I would like to invite invite Yasemin, the president of Northern Justice Watch, to join us and give the remark on behalf of Northern Justice Watch. Please oppose her. Yes, you can join us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wish my students came.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to welcome you all on behalf of Northern Justice Watch. Thank you for taking time to join us today for this critical seminar focused on atrocity crimes and, more importantly, how we as a community, as a professionals, and as advocates can respond to such crimes through effective evidence gathering. Northern Justice Watch is a human rights organization committed to supporting survivors of injustice and empowering communities through legal education and advocacy. One of the ways we do this through the LIVE project, which means Legal Understanding and Victim Empowerment, a legal education initiative made possible by generous support from the Law Foundation of Ontario. Today's seminar is part of a series under the LIVE project. In fact, this is our second session, and we are excited to continue with 10 more throughout 2025 and 2026. Each seminar is designed to make legal knowledge more accessible, more practical, and more responsive to the real-world experiences of survivors.
courses on that one. So I am going to arrange that one and include in one of the seminars. You'll get an email for that. I also want to thank you everyone for coming here. I know you have a lot of questions about ICC, International Criminal Court, what are the domestic mechanism and what's the universal jurisdiction and what can you do. Mark talked about this international mechanism, individual versus state responsibility. So all of those will be detailed we will be discussed in detail in next seminar, chapter 3. We just want to make sure that we don't overload everything and go phase by phase. And then we will then, you then will understand more broadly what can do, and then maybe we can do evidence collection to actually work towards that goal. Lastly, I just want to make that there has been some confusion, I think, about Human Rights Action Group's partnership. We value Human Rights Action Group so much, but this project is specifically by Northern Justice Watch. Human Rights Action Group did not involve with the materials. They wanted to make us clear that this is a separate project from them. And thank you so much for coming here, and I'll see you in the next seminar.
Thank you very much. And then the last, speaker of this workshop, we invite Joanna Hodges for her remarks. She's actually human rights activist and board member of the Genocide Victims Alliance, and then she's also a filmmaker, and we're very grateful to have her, and she's been one of the profound advocate for human rights, and this from the last 2 years I've been working with her, and we are so proud to have her with us today. Please join us.
Thanks, Dr. Sharon. So I jotted down a couple of thoughts while we were. I thought I think I should affirm and say out loud on the record that I think that what we've done here today is actually, it really matters. We talked about atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. We unpacked those legal frameworks, explored documentation strategies, heard ideas on how important it is to preserve evidence that could one day help hold perpetrators accountable. But I think it's really important that we think of this seminar as not the end. It's just the beginning of something, and that knowledge alone will not change the world or our situations, our cases. It's what we do with it now that we have some of that information, and each of us, whether we come from legal backgrounds, survivor communities, civil society, or we just have deep moral convictions, we all can actually have a role to play in what comes next. So I think if you've come from a community that's been harmed, knowing that your voice and your memory, your courage are essential, and you aren't alone. We're building alliances and communities and initiatives like this in Canada and beyond. And the people who are, I think we're all refusing silence and demanding justice. And we can find ways to support survivors. We can challenge the systems that protect perpetrators. We can help build legal pathways that weren't there before. So I think what's next is we keep building and connect and organize and take what we've learned and apply it in courtrooms and communities, in parliament, in the media. And at the Alliance of Genocide Victim Communities, we really believe in the power of collective learning, but also in collective pressure. Pressure is so important. And we don't want to just be heard, we want to shape policy. We want to find that justice also. So I wanted to thank Hilal, Mark, Northern Justice Watch for putting this on together, and we stand with you and we move together forward. And it's our turn to kind of take that knowledge and put it into action. and never, never let justice be forgotten.
Thank you very much, Ron, for your incredible remark. I think probably is a good time to end the workshop. Once again, I really thank all of you for attending this workshop, and then also I'm really thankful and grateful to the volunteers who really put everything together and worked hard, and all our distinguished speakers, Mark Thurston, Dr. Mark Thurston, Hilal, Joan, and Yasamin, and the rest who really participated in the discussions. And also thanks to Mr. Ali, who's been always very hardworking for bringing this kind of meetings together. And I wish you all the best. We have still some foods left. You can help yourself. We have a time to, kind of exchange idea and so on. Have some social interaction. And all the best. Enjoy the rest of the day of Sunday, and then hopefully we'll see you in our next workshop. Thank you very much.
And thank you for being moderator, Tahir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.